Character development, and the extent to which it's included or not included in a story, is one of the key metrics used by critics to judge whether a piece of media, whether that's a book or a film, is successful. Character development is key to creating a convincing and compelling narrative in your story. So today I want to walk you through a few different things that you need to include in order to make sure that your story has good character development. But first, we need to define what exactly we mean when we use the term character development. Essentially, it's concerned with how a character changes over the course of a narrative. Now, notice that I didn't use the word grow there, because character development isn't always positive. It can be negative too. But basically what we're wanting to focus on is how a character is changed by the experiences that they go through, or molded by the events that happen to them over the course of a narrative. Really, we're just focused on how this character changes from the start of the story to the end of the story. But doing that is a lot easier said than done. There's a few elements that we really need to keep in mind when we're trying to create realistic and compelling character development over the course of a story. So let's examine a few of those now. First, and most importantly when designing character development, you have to realize that no character can be perfect. Just like real people, your characters in your story have to have strengths and weaknesses. They have to have vices and virtues. There's nothing more boring than watching a perfect character overcome every obstacle with ease and having no flaws about them. What really draws people in and makes them convinced by a character is that they can see some of their own strengths and weaknesses within that person. And because there's no perfect people, having a perfect character who's all strength and no weakness means that we can't relate to that person and your audience will quickly lose interest in what they're doing. Let's look at a really good example of a three-dimensional, strong and weak character. Evelyn Wang from Everything Everywhere All at Once is a great example of a deep, rich and three-dimensional character. She's hardworking, loyal to her family, and doing everything she can to help her business succeed. But she's also impatient, belligerent, and overly concerned with controlling the perception of her daughter. By the end of the film, and without spoilers, she's overcome many of these flaws and emerges a better, stronger person because of it. It's so important that we've included these weaknesses that we can all relate to so that the audience here connects with Evelyn and wishes her to succeed. It's really important to note as well that this also counts for our antagonists, for the bad people within our story. They need to have good points as well as bad points. We don't want just some mustache-twirling villain. We want a three-dimensional, deep, rich character who maybe, in part of us, almost agrees with what they're doing and can understand why they're doing it. Let's look at another really great example of a three-dimensional villain. Hans Landa from Inglourious Basterds is a great example of a villain with positive and negative attributes. He's intelligent and charismatic and confident and able to adapt to almost any situation. These are all things that most of us would consider to be good. But he's also brutal and manipulative and callous and vicious. We don't like him because of these negative traits. But such a compelling villain allows us to root all the more for our protagonists. Long story short, your protagonist and your antagonist must have strengths and weaknesses. Weaknesses for them to overcome and save the day, and strengths to be defeated in our antagonist. So don't forget that. No character is perfect. Secondly, we need to understand what the character's motivations are. We, as the reader or as the audience, want to know why this character is doing the things that they're doing. Are they moving closer to their goal or further away from it? How are they justifying their actions in the pursuit of this motivation? Just like in real life again, all of us have motivations for doing everything that we do. We study hard because we want to learn a language. We exercise a lot because we want to impress our crush. Or maybe we just relax and watch YouTube because we want to relax. But every action that we take has a motivation behind it. So it's really important that when you're writing a character, you know why they're doing things, and you establish this early in order to invest the reader in the journey. Think about Harry Potter wishing to avenge his parents by defeating Lord Voldemort, or Thanos wanting to bring balance to an overpopulated, greedy universe. The best characters have motivations that are understandable and quite often relatable. Even if we don't exactly agree, we can understand why they think that way and why they're pursuing that goal. So, long story short, make sure that your characters have clear motivations. Third, a super important part of any good story is a challenge or an obstacle for our protagonist to overcome. It's so important that when a character's going on a journey, they don't get everything their own way, that their weaknesses are exposed or their strengths aren't quite good enough. We need our character to fail. We need them to go through hardships. There's even an old expression in writing and filmmaking, which is that a character is only as great as the problem that they overcome. So the bigger the problem, the more satisfied we feel when our hero or heroine has overcome that challenge. Challenges can take many forms. They could be the villain or the antagonist, a character who's working against our hero achieving their goals. They could be physical or mental limitations based on our character's weaknesses that are exploited. But whatever they are, they need to be convincing and they need to stand in the way of our hero from reaching their objective. Great examples are Darth Vader to Luke Skywalker, who poses an enormous challenge to the young Jedi, or Katniss Everdeen facing the machine of the Capitol. As people, we're drawn to underdog stories and tales of people beating the odds. For convincing character development, your character must be challenged, suffer setbacks, and most of all, suffer defeats. Failures are the best teacher, as we're so often told, and we need our main characters to fail sometimes. This makes them relatable, as all of us have failed at something in our lives. Again, this goes back to our first point, these are not perfect people. We need to see them fail, we need to see them being vulnerable so that we can relate and connect with them more. And that's so important for convincing character development. The final point is connected to everything we've talked about already, which is that the success the character achieves must be earned. No character is perfect, and no character is entitled to the success that they get. When we're seeing our character go through their journey, we need to see effort. You can't study a language and just be good at it one day. You have to put in a lot of work. Rocky trained day and night to become the fighter that he was at the end of his film, and he still lost, but we felt like he'd won because we saw how much effort and hard work he put into achieving that success. Frodo had his finger bitten off and was stabbed and corrupted by the ring, and that's what made us drawn to him all the more. We saw how hard he tried in order to achieve his success. So overcoming obstacles and reaching this objective cannot and must not be easy for our character. We need to see them struggle. We need to see them put in the work. We need to see them training and studying in order to become stronger and defeat the weaknesses within their character and overcome the obstacles that are ahead of them. The key with creating a meaningful struggle and hard work and training that feels authentic and real is mixing and matching, having lots of different elements that come into play to help our character get stronger. This could be getting guidance from a mentor, asking for help when they're at their lowest point, failing and being motivated to try again. There are lots of different tools that we can use here to make sure that success feels earned. But that's what it must be. It must be earned, because nothing in life is given to you on a plate. And if it is, people around you don't generally like that. So if you want your character to be likable and strong and powerful and have great skills by the end of their journey, then you must show them working hard and trying to overcome the challenges in front of them. So, in summary, creating meaningful character development is often the single greatest point within a book. It's what draws people in and makes them stay till the end. Character development is often the target of lots of criticism, but it's also the trophy of the most praise if done correctly. When you're writing your story and designing your characters, putting lots of effort into character creation and character development is not a waste of time and can be the really big difference between a good book and a bad book. Having a perfect character is not interesting for our book. It doesn't provide a person that our reader can attach themselves to and see themselves within. We want to see a character with flaws and weaknesses because it makes the struggle so much more interesting and makes their journey more believable. Just imagine if there was a character who was handsome and charming and charismatic and intelligent and well kept and rich and successful. None of us would really believe that this person can actually exist. And that's exactly the point. We all understand that we live in a world that is not perfect, and therefore it's impossible for a perfect person to exist within it. So when we're writing our book, we need to make sure that we're being honest to reality, no matter what genre we're writing. We need to understand that we can't have a perfect character who is good at everything and doesn't have any weaknesses. This is so important for reader enjoyment, for believing the story and feeling the tension and the stakes within it. If everything is perfect and a character can do everything, there's no journey to go on, there's no lesson to learn, and there's no obstacle to be overcome because they can do it all already. At a deeper level, as an audience, we want to be able to relate and connect with that character. It's almost a relief for most of us to see our heroes and heroines struggling, to know that they also have problems just like we do, to know that they fail and have struggles just like we do. Idols in fiction or non-fiction provide examples for us to look up to, knowing that if they can overcome their problems, then maybe we can too. A perfect character doesn't provide this. The final point on why it's so important is because a character's weakness often defines the level of their success. There can be a hesitancy amongst new writers to introduce lots of negative things about their characters, as if they feel that it somehow takes it away. It's not that weaknesses are more important than strengths, but they are important for defining how much a character achieves by the end of their journey. If they have lots of weaknesses at the start, we feel so much more inspired and empowered by them when they overcome them all to succeed. Or maybe when they don't overcome their weaknesses and they still succeed through sheer willpower or determination. It teaches us a really good moral lesson, that we can overcome our weaknesses and achieve whatever we want to. So creating a perfect character undermines this philosophy, undermines the moral message that all good storytelling gives us. And that's what we have to keep in mind, and that's why it's so important. So now that we understand why it's so important, how do we go about creating a rounded, three-dimensional character? The first answer should be fairly obvious. First, you need to establish your character's background, as this goes a long way to determining what kind of person they are, though be careful about falling into stereotypes. Not all doctors are rich, and not all priests are kind. Understanding a background is more about showing you what options for traits and skills are likely to have been available for your character. If they don't have a piloting background, it's unlikely that they can fly a plane. Don't give your character skills that they wouldn't have developed in their backstory, and don't give them a backstory where they could have developed all the skills, because that's not possible. Don't be afraid of going down the rabbit hole. The deeper you understand the background of your character, the better. Each piece of their background you build can inform you of more skills and help you build that well-rounded character. The more detail you add here allows you to more closely define your character and the way they'll behave and interact with others. It's important to use this to explore the weaknesses especially. What did they not have? What bad habits or thoughts could they have developed? Is our doctor numb to seeing pain, or developed a gambling addiction because they have the money and need to deal with the pressure of their work? These are all things that we can explore with every character's background. So, once you have a background, let's look at the traits they have. Characters need to have positive and negative attributes in a particular balance. But it's not as simple as saying that you just have to list the strengths and weaknesses and voila. More strengths doesn't equal a good character, just as more weaknesses doesn't equal a bad character. These qualities are fluid. They can change over the course of a novel, and are employed differently depending on a character's motivation and background. For example, a character could possess the strength of determination. But what are they determined to do? Are they determined to save the world or destroy it? Determination is a strong character trait, but it's not good or bad. We'll discuss motivations in the next video, but when you're designing your character, it's better to select qualities in a neutral mindset and understand that strengths can be diminished and weaknesses can be overcome. Additionally, having weaknesses is a really great thing for character development. You can watch your character grow from being timid into being confident, or being cowardly to brave, and this gives so much satisfaction to the reader, to the character, and to the author to write something like that. So having weaknesses isn't a bad thing. In fact, for storytelling, it's such a great thing. And while a character might start off with weaknesses that maybe we don't like, by the end of the story they can grow out of those in a natural, progressive way. So don't be afraid of the weaknesses, include them. They allow so much flexibility for storytelling. On top of that, it's also important to understand, for the nature of the story, how these character traits end. Now you've got two choices here. If you understand what your strengths and weaknesses are of each character at the beginning of the story, you can either plan what those will turn into by the end. Will they get stronger or weaker? Will they lose strengths or gain weaknesses? Or you can just let it happen organically as you're writing. It really depends on what style of writing you prefer. In general, it's better to plan. That way you know the end point for your character and you know what steps they need to take to change those traits. But it might be more enjoyable for you as an author and for the reader if you let it happen organically, not really planning how a character is going to change over the course of the story. Because hopefully, as things happen to them, they should naturally change anyway. For me, I'd prefer to plan, but it's entirely up to you. It can be useful to think of this like designing a video game character. You can put points into certain attributes, such as intelligence or charisma, but ultimately the player, or the writer in this case, decides if they are used for good or evil. They start with a set of skills based on their background and then embark on a journey that makes them stronger as they gain experience. But that initial selection means certain tasks are more or less difficult. Another point here is that internally, how a character's traits interact with each other is important, and there are obviously some that don't go well together. There's always a trade-off in qualities. Ned Stark from A Song of Ice and Fire was honourable, but that meant he was more naive than others and vulnerable to manipulation. Varys, on the other hand, was deeply manipulating and cunning, but at the cost of constantly looking over his shoulder and not having any honour. Make sure you're noting down the consequences of each feature you select, because this will inform how your character behaves, how others treat them, and therefore allow you to write consistently. A final point before we look at an example is that you shouldn't make other characters weaker in order to make your protagonist or antagonist stronger. It can be tempting to purposely leave flaws in your antagonist for the sake of allowing them to be beaten, or just to make your protagonist appear stronger. This is a really big mistake that some writers fall afoul of. Each character should be an island when being designed, independent of their relationship to others unless it's part of their background. The most interesting interactions ever put to film or paper are between two strong characters who both have strengths that balance one another. Make sure you aren't failing to develop other characters just to advance another. This can be especially difficult if you have a large cast of characters. Stay consistent with how you write, plan your story well, and your reader will be more grateful to read a confrontation or challenge where the outcome isn't immediately obvious due to the imbalance between character strengths. To communicate this to an audience, it's important that the character themselves demonstrates their skill and traits through their thoughts, actions, and words. Let's use an example to illustrate how this can be done. This is from Lee Child's The Killing Floor. "Right," he said. "We got a few questions, don't we?" The voice was deep, like a rumble, not a southern accent. He looked and sounded like a Boston banker, except he was black. "My name is Finley," he said. "My rank is captain. I am chief of this department's detective bureau. I understand you have been apprised for your rights. You have not yet confirmed that you understood them. Before we go any further, we must pursue that preliminary matter." Not a Boston banker, more like a Harvard guy. "I understand my rights," I said. He nodded. "Good," he said. "I'm glad about that. Where's your lawyer?" "I don't need a lawyer," I said. "You're charged with murder," he said. "You need a lawyer. We'll provide one, you know, free of charge. Do you want us to provide one, free of charge?" "No, I don't need a lawyer," I said. From this exchange, we can see many of Jack Reacher's traits demonstrated by his behaviour, words, and thoughts. Let's start with his thoughts. The short sentences and deductions show us that he is precise and analytical. He is studious and knowledgeable as he can determine region-specific accents and university backgrounds. We could guess that he perhaps overthinks or maybe jumps to conclusions due to him making a lot of assumptions about somebody he's meeting for the first time. Here we have strengths and weaknesses. As for behaviour, There's no mention of movement or any physical reactions, so we can guess that he's a confident person, no stranger to police stations or high-pressure situations. This is a great example of less is more too, as the absence of words helps us understand who he is. As for dialogue, he is direct and clear. He is assertive in his positions and confident about what he wants, not using a single word more than necessary. We can assume he has a strong will because of this, is determined and efficient, but perhaps keeps people at a distance and struggles to form intimate relationships. So this example provides a great demonstration of how you can show a variety of character traits in such a short space of writing. The way Jack speaks, the length of sentences, and the manner of his thoughts, the way he conducts himself and his physical reactions all tell us about his character. None of this is being directly told, but shown to us, the reader, and using less is more shows us some of Jack's key characteristics too. If you were to learn that his background was as a military investigator with a military family, then we wouldn't be surprised to find any of these attributes that we've identified. And over the course of the book, he utilizes those analytical skills and physical confidence to great effect, while also struggling to maintain amicable relationships due to his strong will and stoic nature. Importantly, all of this is established in the first 2 chapters, so the reader understands who they are dealing with. Introducing the core aspects of your character early is so important to invest your reader and familiarize themselves with who they're following. As we discussed in the first chapter video, it's essential that we're introducing our protagonist to the reader straight away, with their strengths shown and at least implying their weaknesses, although those can be exposed later if we need to. Backgrounds can also be revealed over time, but traits need to be immediate. We should also quickly look at a piece of perfect characterization, as in, it's not good. This doesn't occur often in publishing due to how rigorous the industry is, but it can occur in films and TV due to the limited duration they have to develop a character properly and show all of their skills and development. Let's quickly look at Rey from Star Wars as a character who is not well-rounded. Her background is an orphan who is abandoned by her parents and sold to local crime bosses to salvage junk. We could reasonably expect that she should be emotionally hard, resentful, maybe even skeptical of trusting others. Having grown up in a harsh environment and wishing to escape, surrounded by other hard people, she could be opportunistic and calculating. As for skills, we could guess that she has some basic skills in engineering and resourcefulness, but other than that, her background and location don't seem great for learning more. All of this is reasonable and creates quite a unique and nuanced character whose journey we would be interested to follow. Instead, what we get is a person who is kind, trusting, smart, noble and brave, and completely honest. She is able to pilot a starship with no practice and even outmaneuver experienced pilots. She is able to shoot perfectly against trained soldiers, use a lightsaber without training, even defeating an experienced fighter. She can use force powers without any effort or training. We are not given any reason to believe that she had developed or was born with these skills and attributes, and most of all, there are no identifiable weaknesses that aren't easily overcome. As an audience, it can be hard to connect with such a character because we don't see ourselves in them. We can't imagine ourselves doing all the feats that she achieves within the same level of effort or such a difficult background. So the takeaway from all of this is that you need to put effort into developing your character's backgrounds, their traits, their abilities, and their weaknesses. You need to understand that no character should be perfect, and if they are, it completely disconnects the reader from the experience. Characters need to have flaws. They can have virtues too, but they must have vices. Motivation for your character is one of the most important and interesting parts of character creation and story development. A motivation is what makes us interested in the journey that our character is going on, no matter how big or small it is. A motivation is what sucks us in and makes us want to continue that journey all the way to the end to see it succeed or fail. A motivation is what makes us root for our favourite characters and what makes us hate our worst characters. Just like in real life, every character and person needs a motivation for the things that they do. Imagine for a moment a book full of characters where they're just ambling around with no goals or motivations. They have nothing that they want, nothing that they need, nothing that they're going to do in the future, no reason for doing anything, and no ambitions for the future. And that's not a story. There's nothing there. And that's because we understand as people that we live in a world that is dominated by different motivations. motivations that interact with one another, that clash and that challenge each other, that sometimes align and sometimes go against one another. Motivations are a really key part of creating interesting characters. It's something that we look for in real people, and it's something that our characters need to have in every story that we tell. And that also means that every character needs to have a motivation. Even if you don't express that, you need to understand when you're planning that all of your characters have to have a reason and a goal for doing things within your story. Like we discussed in our non-perfect character video, we as an audience want to see characters represented on screen that we can see part of ourselves within. We want to see that the people that we root for get the successful end that they deserved, and that the people we are rooting against don't achieve their motivations. We need this. It's part of the human nature to cling to things that inspire us to create our own goals and achieve our own motivations. Ultimately, a character without motivation doesn't provide this and seriously diminishes the story that you're trying to tell. We should also outline what it is exactly we mean when we use the word motivation. And really, this can be split down into two different elements, the goals and the reasons. The goals are obviously the end point of a character's journey, what it is that they're aiming for. These can be wants or needs. These can change over time. They can be long-term and short-term. For example, Frodo's goals within The Lord of the Rings change multiple times. To begin with, it's just to hide the ring, then to go to Bree, then to go to Rivendell, and then ultimately to destroy the ring. And the best stories have a combination of temporary short-term goals and permanent long-term goals, with the short-term ones acting like stepping stones leading to that ultimate objective. All of these serve to keep the reader engaged and interested in the story as it unfolds. The second part of what it is to have a motivation is the reason. Why is the character doing what they're doing? What is it about them as a person that convinces them that reaching that goal is the correct thing to do? Reasons, unlike goals, tend to be more permanent because they're part of the makeup of who that person or character is. They can develop over time during the story. They can fade away, or new reasons can be added as things happen to the character on their journey. But generally, the reason behind the goal needs to be compelling and convincing and related to who that character is as a person. These are where the really interesting conflicts come into play. The reasoning between two different characters on very different courses who are maybe going against each other. It's the reasons that make that conflict compelling, and the reasons are really important behind creating a strong, motivated goal too. Strong goals and reasons are essential to creating a character that is both likable and relatable. By having convincing and compelling goals and reasons and overall a motivation, we can empathize with what they're doing. We should be able to understand why they're doing it and almost root for them to succeed, even if they're an antagonist within the story. And that's what creates really great conflict. Cersei Lannister and Ned Stark from the A Song of Ice and Fire series are a great example of this. Cersei wants to protect her children, which is something that we can all naturally understand, while Ned is searching for honor and truth, which is also something we are compelled to believe is the correct thing to do. And this sets up a really interesting conflict between the two characters. So getting a strong motivation based on strong goals and strong reasons is essential to hooking your reader in, investing them in the story, and building tension about what will happen as the journey unfolds. The first important point is that motivations need to be established early after a character's introduction. This isn't universal, and for mysterious characters, a lot of the fun can be in not knowing why they're doing the things they are. Similarly, for antagonists, we can reveal their motivations over time to build intrigue and a sense of investigation. But for our protagonists and any main characters that we regularly interact with, then their goals and motivations need to be established early on. This is crucial because we need to get the reader on board. We need to give them a sense of direction for the story, but also because a person's reasons for doing something is a key part of their character, and something we need to learn about what kind of person they are. The earlier we understand the stakes and the end point, the more we can understand why the character is doing or not doing certain things. This allows us to develop them further and build tension by having them move further or closer away from their goal. If we don't know why something is happening, or whether it's intended to happen at all, the reader doesn't know how to react and will default to simply not caring, which is the worst thing they can do. To explain how to write motivations, we need to split them between goals and reasons, because they are generally expressed differently, so let's start with the goals. By and large, goals occur in one of two ways in the story. They are either given to the character, or the character makes a decision to pursue them. Like in a video game, this is the difference between being given a quest by an NPC that lays out your objectives, parameters, locations, and all with the promise of some reward, while conversely, you could see bandits attacking a civilian and make the decision on your own to intervene based on your own understanding of what is correct or fun. In storytelling, these are largely the two ways goals are established with a character. If we look at these two quotes from Lord of the Rings, it gives us some great examples from Frodo. Dear Frodo, bad news has reached me here. I must go off at once. You had better leave Bag End soon, and get out of the Shire before the end of July at latest. I will return as soon as I can, and I will follow you, if I find that you are gone. Leave a message for me here. If you pass through Bree, you can trust the landlord, Butterbur. You may meet a friend of mine on the road, a man, lean, dark, tall, by some called Strider. He knows our business and will help you. Make for Rivendell. There I hope we can meet again. If I do not come, Elrond will advise you. Yours in haste, Gandalf. This is an example of Frodo being given multiple goals by Gandalf that spurs him further through his quest. Later in the story, Frodo must make his own goals. At last, with an effort he spoke, and wondered to hear his own words, as if some other will was using his small voice. I will take the ring, he said, though I do not know the way. Both of these examples show Frodo's goals, and importantly, they are spelled out clearly, so that we, the reader, know exactly what Frodo intends to do. That is the important writing point when it comes to goals. They need to be clear and easy to understand for the reader. Most of the time they are expressed through dialogue and conversation between characters, as this is the most natural, or through the internal thoughts of the character. The latter can be especially great if a character lies or doesn't want their true intentions known to other characters. As for the reasons behind doing something, this is slightly more complicated to write. But just like with goals, there are generally two ways to do this. The first is through direct voicing of those reasons, either through dialogue or thought. This is effective and simple, and clearly communicates parts of the personality to the reader and gives us a clear indication of their rationale. Using dialogue is a natural and concise way to show the reasons behind a character's motivation. Here is an example of that. They kept going, because they were holding on to something. What are we holding on to, Sam? That there's some good in this world, Mr. Frodo, and it's worth fighting for. In that sample, Sam clearly states the reason why they should continue their journey. In dialogue, it comes across naturally and is a good example of telling their reasons. Sometimes this is unavoidable. It would be very tricky to show that they are continuing because there's good in the world. So here, telling is a great choice. More than that, persuasion is another great way to use dialogue to show reason. If a character is successfully persuaded by another's arguments and agrees to undertake the task for them, then we, the reader, know exactly why they're doing so, or the character can state an alternative reason for accepting. Let's look at this clip from Rocky.
Rocky, do you believe that America is the land of opportunity?
Yeah.
Apollo Creed does. And he's going to prove it to the whole world by giving an unknown a shot at the title. And that unknown is you. He picked you, Rocky. Rocky, it's the chance of a lifetime. You can't pass it by. What do you say?
The second way to express a character's reasoning is simply through their actions. This is less clear, but can tell us a lot about their personality. After all, actions speak louder than words. If your character stands up to some bullies, we don't need them to tell us,
I don't like bullies.
Because we can see through their act of defiance that they don't, and therefore we know the reason they're willing to fight. It can seem cool to have one-liners that state a reason, but in truth, most people don't speak like movie stars, and let their actions show their real character and internal motivations. This requires more assumptions on the part of the reader, but that makes the character more interesting and allows them to build their own personal image in their head. Here's an example from Reacher.
Look at this redwood motherfucker. What you want?
To give you a choice. See, you're in my house, fatso, and you didn't ask permission. So you and your friends can leave now, or they can carry your fat ass out in a bucket.
There's no stated reason, but we understand Reacher's motivation in this scene. The trick is that this way of writing is more challenging, and different audiences could get different impressions. But, in my opinion, that is part of the magic of reading and writing. If you focus on the actions of the characters, rather than having them spell everything out for the reader, you will create a more nuanced and natural character that your reader is more likely to connect with. Defining challenge isn't as simple as it might seem at first, and that's mostly because what constitutes a challenge is very broad and quite subjective. In storytelling, a challenge is something that stops, prevents, or gets in the way of our protagonist reaching their goal. These can be a range of different things, from geography to antagonistic characters to mental and physical limitations or social pressures, and really the list goes on. But they're all important to include in order to build convincing character development. Challenges really are the core part of character development, because they are what forces the character to develop. A challenge stands in the way of our character reaching that final destination. They force them to change, to grow, to become creative in order to overcome the problem ahead of them. It's why when we were talking about our perfect characters, they can't be perfect, because then there's no challenge and therefore there's no development. So a challenge is a really essential part of the story. It is what pushes our character to go beyond their limits, adopt new skills, and grow as a person. There's a reason we use the expression, failure is the best teacher. And that's because all of us understand that in the real world, the most prominent lessons within our lives are the times that we failed, the times that we've struggled, the times where something has been in our way and we've had to overcome it. These are often the most rewarding things in our life. And it's the reason that we love underdog stories. It's the reason we love and always root for the little guy in the fight, because we understand how great it feels to overcome a challenge. And that's the exact same reason why it's so important in storytelling too. Your characters need to have that challenge to push them and to help them grow and develop as a character. Challenges really speak to something within us, especially if this character is not perfect and they're flawed and they have all of these problems within them. Especially if they have that motivation behind them to get to that goal. That's when the challenge becomes such an essential part of the story, and it can often be the climax. It's the ultimate part where the hero finally overcomes that challenge, is where we get the most satisfaction in storytelling. So how can we write that into our story? Well, I'm going to show you a few different ways that you can do that, and a few of the essential elements that you need to include for a challenge, and I'm going to be using Star Wars as my example to illustrate this. The first point is that all challenges need to be set up before they occur. This is important for keeping your audience expectations and creating tension. Even if your character is ambushed, you at least need to remark or hint at the location they're in being hostile. This goes back to Hitchcock's famous ticking bomb analogy. If your reader doesn't know to expect the bomb exploding, they only get the surprise of the explosion and miss out on so many of the other emotions. Yet showing the bomb beforehand builds dread and tension, which is far more engrossing. As we spoke about in our contrivances video, having that setup helps you avoid creating a contrivance here, something that's just thrown in the way seemingly at random and breaking all the rules. Minor challenges that test and train the character naturally require less setup, maybe only a few lines. But the larger the challenge, the more you need to foreshadow it and hint about it to avoid it becoming contrived. In A New Hope, minor initial challenges, such as stormtroopers, are set up through exposition, such as Obi-Wan telling Luke,
"Only Imperial stormtroopers are so precise,"
and seeing their actions at Luke's home. This then builds a fear within us about the challenge Luke will have to face later. Major challenges like Darth Vader are introduced immediately into the story, and we understand as the audience that Luke will need to face this in the future when he's ready. The second point is that challenges need to be believable. As we discussed in the contrivances video, challenges have to be natural to the context, obey the rules, and believably overcome. If the gap is too large and is closed too quickly, it will break the reader immersion. The larger the challenge, the more setup it requires to beat, and therefore the more believable it will be. We'll talk about effort in the final part of this series, but for now we should acknowledge that challenges should be proportional to the scale of setup and time in order to maintain realistic expectations from the audience. The reader needs to believe that this challenge is genuine and not thrown in randomly, hence the need for setup. More than that, it needs to fit within the rules of the world you've established and not break them. Don't break the rules just to make a challenge more intimidating or difficult than it would naturally be, as this will make the reader feel as if the writer is making things unfair for no reason. In Star Wars, we're given enough information about the world that challenges such as stormtroopers and Darth Vader feel as if they would exist within it. Their strength is perfectly reasonable within the world and doesn't feel artificially inflated to create contrived challenges. It could be argued that stormtroopers are artificially weakened, and you'd be right, but that was a creative choice taken to allow the plot to exist. A contrivance to be sure, but perhaps a necessary one that the creator had to weigh up in their own mind. Challenges have to carry consequences, and while that word could have some negative connotations, I don't mean it to. Whatever the outcome from facing the challenge, our characters have to learn and change because of it, even if it's in a minor way. Only a perfect character gets through every struggle without it having any influence over them at all. Think about every challenge you've faced. It has always had an impact on you physically, mentally, or spiritually. The same has to be said in your story. The size of the impact should be proportional to the size of the challenge too, and in line with the character's background. Because challenges are so fundamental to the development of your character, you must clearly show how it's impacted them. They can learn from the challenges, be damaged by them, be strengthened or wounded. The choice is yours, but make sure that they react consistently with how you've designed them. Take the time to think about it before you commit. And remember to think about the effects on all the parties involved, how that will change their narrative and the world at large. The challenge of rescuing Leia from the Death Star and losing his mentor has a visible impact on Luke. He is saddened by it, but all the more resolute to join the rebellion and fight back against the Empire. It even breeds a hatred within him for Darth Vader that will be played on later. As a consequence, Luke is no longer the boy from Tatooine, but a soldier in a rebellion and a training Jedi. Similar to consequences, it's absolutely imperative that your protagonist fails during some of their challenges in order to create convincing development, to avoid contrivances and avoid perfect characters. This will usually be their biggest test and their lowest point within the story, but it's essential for showing them as a realistic and relatable character. It should also be near total failure that leaves them vulnerable and often in need of assistance. This builds tension and acts as the largest catalyst for them to complete their quest and grow as a character. It should go without saying that the failure will be the ultimate teacher for the protagonist and will ultimately play a large part in overcoming their ultimate challenge and achieving their goal by the end of the story. As a reader, we want to see them get back on their feet. We want them to become stronger because we want to believe that we can do the same. Perfect characters never lose, and none of us are perfect, so make sure your character loses something. The obvious example in Star Wars is Luke losing his first fight with Darth Vader, having his hand cut off, losing his lightsaber, and having his reality shattered at the revelation of his father's identity. This is a near total failure that necessitates him being rescued and leaves him broken but eager to finish his journey and bring his father back to the light. But as an audience member, it makes us believe that he's a real person, it makes him relatable, and it makes us root for him all the more. Of course, the final part of a challenge is overcoming it. In most stories, your protagonist will ultimately achieve some form of victory. Even in stories where they lose, like Rocky losing his fight, there should still be some sense of victory for the reader. That the character is now stronger, has beaten challenges and emerges from the story a better person. Not perfect, just better. Of course, the ultimate challenge should never be easy, and the best are often a close called affair that keeps the tension until the last moment. That being said, challenges need to be overcome if you want to communicate a positive message, like one of hope, for example. This should be where your protagonist has overcome a major hurdle that, when initially introduced, seemed impossible. There should be enough growth and development by the time they reach this point that we believe they could have reached that conclusion. That doesn't eliminate any consequences, of course. So they could be bittersweet like Rocky, with both victory and defeat all at once. But the ultimate challenge should be set aside. Of course, in Star Wars, this is Luke defeating Vader in their final duel, taking the moral victory by sparing his life, and then finally reconciling with his father after they've defeated the Emperor. So, just remember that challenge is the core, essential ingredient to building a character who develops over the course of their journey. Don't forget to include tough challenges, and you can include way more than one. Have lots of smaller challenges, big challenges, failures, and successes to build a comprehensive, well-rounded, and three-dimensional character. If you've enjoyed Defining effort is the simplest of all of the elements of character development. Simply, it is the amount of time and struggle a character puts into achieving their goal, overcoming their challenges, and changing as a person for the better. That doesn't mean it's any less important, so let's explore why it's so important and how we can incorporate that into our story to make perfect character development. There's an old rule in storytelling, which is that protagonists are never lucky. And this is because giving our characters luck and helping them get through the story is often seen as very contrived and the writer taking a shortcut because they don't know how to develop the character further. Just think about it for a moment. In real life, if you were to see someone just be lucky all the time, never have to put in any effort to overcome their challenges or get their achievements, how would you feel about that person? Probably not very positively for most of us. So we need to remember that protagonists can't be lucky in a story, because it doesn't really reflect real life. After all, the existence of luck is a big debate in of itself. So when we're writing, we need to make sure we're avoiding that. As with all parts of character development, seeing a character undertake genuine and believable effort in order to achieve their goal is something that deeply relates them to the reader. We all understand that nothing in life comes for free, that everything that we've achieved and succeeded in usually required an amount of effort. Maybe that's a little, or maybe it's a lot, but it all required effort. So it's exactly the same when we're seeing our fictional or non-fictional characters represented in books or films. We want to see them trying. We want to see them putting in the work to get their successes, to make sure that they've earned them. Because not only does that inspire us to try harder in our own lives in order to achieve what we want, and gives us a positive role model that we can follow, but also it reflects the real world. We don't want to follow a character who's perfect, as we've discussed multiple times throughout this series. So effort is a really crucial part of that in preventing a character from being perfect. Most effort is going to take the form of learning or improving a skill. How this is done is up to you in the context of your book, and it can be anything from physical training to book studying. But whatever it's doing, it needs to be focused on making the character stronger. There needs to be a direct connection between what the character is doing and the challenge that they're trying to overcome. Which is why so often when we see a character putting in effort, it's usually with that end goal in mind. Think Rocky, Amelie, The Shawshank Redemption. All of these are focused on determination and resilience in order to achieve a goal, because that's a really inspiring story for us as people. Ultimately, effort is really important because it makes a character likable, relatable, and believable. It also makes their conclusion and their eventual success satisfying and rewarding for the reader because we can see how much effort we've put into it. Just like we're proud of our friends and family when they study super hard and pass the test. It's the exact same feeling that we need to replicate in storytelling. So let's look at a few different elements that you need to include to make sure that effort is portrayed correctly in your story. The first most important part of correctly writing effort is that it needs to take time within the story in order for the progress and improvement to be believable. The effort can be the focus of the entire story, or it can be condensed as part of a challenge with an emphasis on how much time has passed. In a film, this might take the form of a montage, but in writing, it's better to explain the activity being undertaken and then have it take place for the appropriate amount of time. You can show this with seasonal changes, purchases, or simply telling your audience if you don't want to spend too much time with it. Research is important here. You need to understand how long something takes to achieve. Your character won't learn a language or be proficient in martial arts overnight. You need to make sure that the time taken is proportional to the effect you need it to have. In most circumstances, this will be a long time, unless the rules of your world behave differently, like in The Matrix. An example of showing the effort's duration is Harry Potter's ability in magic. It is poor in the first book, but it is repeatedly told to us and shown through classroom scenes that he is training and practicing. The entire 5th book revolves around the students training and preparing for a final confrontation, and even though they still lose when faced with experienced duelists, but we can believe their skills would have improved because lots of time was invested into improving it, and that was shown to us in the story. Just like in real life, your character's effort should never be easy. If you want to make your character a better sword fighter, that will always be a difficult process, with bruises, cuts and scrapes and punishments. Again, we understand that working out, learning a language, or becoming proficient with magical powers will be a struggle from the start. It might get easier with practice, but that goes back to our first point that it needs time. Rocky's training never seemed easy. It got progressively less difficult as he became stronger, but we were never under the impression that it was easy. That's because he wasn't a perfect character, and the effort to overcome the challenge was part of the challenge. That's something you can really incorporate into your challenges that adds to the motivation, makes them a more well-rounded character, and shows them to be a relatable person that readers can really get behind. A critical part of the difficulty is having moments of failure or doubt during the effort. This shows character development as they push themselves beyond these initial setbacks, and is a key demonstrator of the effort involved as well as their positive development as a character. It also gives us a measuring stick so we can see how far they've come by that time. A third super important part is having a mentor. We cannot learn anything without the help of others, whether that's a teacher or a textbook. Somebody with more experience and knowledge than us was behind that. By giving your character a mentor, not only does it allow them to develop and grow naturally, but it adds a humility to them that shows they're not perfect. Mentors are such important characters within a story and should be treated with respect and veneration, not dismissed and ignored by your protagonists. If your protagonist is arrogant or strong-willed, it can even be part of the effort to have them find humility in accepting the limitations of their power and the need for help. Some of the most beloved characters in history are mentors of our protagonist, who helps them become stronger, gives them direction and motivation, and allows our main character to show their vulnerability but ultimately overcome it and succeed. Think of Obi-Wan, Gandalf, Dumbledore, M, Sir Barristan Selmy, Mary Poppins, or Cersei Lannister. These are all mentors who've taught our characters important lessons and made them stronger because of it. At the end of the day, the way that you show effort is extremely variable, and there are lots of different ways you can do it. But in the end, you need to show your character going through genuine and honest struggles and effort in order to overcome their challenges. It makes them believable. It shows how dedicated they are to their motivations. It shows that they're not perfect, and it gives you a reason to have challenges in the way that they can then overcome and create satisfying stories for your readers. For starters, I should say that likability isn't a quality for all characters within your book, although the more characters that are likable, the more interesting it will be for your audience. Instead, when I'm talking about likability, I'm referring to something very specific. So let's explore that a little bit more now. Now, likable is quite a broad word, so let's try and get a little bit more specific about what we mean when we use it. When I say a character is likable, I don't mean that they are happy and clappy and perfect. We've discussed already why that's a bad idea. Instead, what I mean by likable is that this character has a seed of something that interests the reader. And again, notice that I'm not using the word good, because a villain can be likable. It's important that we make a distinction between I like that person and I would like to follow that character's journey. And really, when we're talking about the literary definition of likability in a character, we're talking much more about wanting to follow what that character does and the journey that they go on. So, how can we write likability into our book? Let's explore that a little bit further. The first thing we need to do to make a character likable is to make them relatable. Relatability means that the reader can imagine themselves acting in the same way in the same situation. We've discussed this a little bit before, but relatability is important for the reader's expectations. They expect a character to act naturally, like a person. By doing this, we allow the reader to invest more personally into the character's journey and therefore care more about the outcomes of their actions. If a character is not relatable, readers do not care about them, and if they don't care about them, they're less likely to like them as well.
Hermione Granger from Harry Potter by J.K. Rowling is a great example of somebody who connected with many young people, including myself, because of how she behaved. She was flawed and quirky, but felt like somebody we knew from school, and acted in a way that most of us imagined someone like that would. We could imagine ourselves as her and doing the same things. On the flip side, I think the recent portrayal of Galadriel is an example of how a character can be thoroughly unrelatable by acting and speaking in ways that most of us never dream of. Despite this being a TV show, not a book, the writing lesson still applies. The way she treated others and acted so rashly didn't fit with a character who was supposed to be compassionate, wise, and good. Because of this, I don't know anybody who could see themselves within her.
The next important quality of a likable character is that they have desirable skills or attributes, or something about them that we want. This invests your readers in, as they want those skills, so therefore they're interested in seeing that character succeed to reinforce their own view that having those skills is a beneficial thing. Desire is of course a more subjective element, because at the end of the day we all want different things, and this is where having a range of characters can be really useful. However, to make a character likable, your reader should want to be them, or at least have some of the skills that they think are great and want to possess themselves in the real world.
A great example of this is the authority and power displayed by Tywin Lannister in A Song of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. This is something that many people want, and that made this character very likable to people who admired such attributes. He wasn't a nice character, but he possessed qualities that many people wanted, and that made him desirable and therefore likable. Conversely, Kichichiro from Silence by Susaku Edo displays only qualities that none of us desire. He is a liar and a traitor who repeatedly causes pain for our main characters. Importantly, he is still a very compelling character, but he is not the person whose story we want to follow due to him having very little to desire.
Another relatively obvious trait that a likable character has is a clear motivation. We've discussed this a little bit more in previous videos on character development, but in general, characters are more relatable and more likable if they have clear goals and objectives, because we want to see them succeed, because we want to believe that we can succeed in our own goals and motivations too.
We've discussed motivation before, so I won't go into lots of detail, but motivation helps us invest in a character's journey and will make us like them if we understand and agree with their aim. This feeds into relatability and desire, as we all want to be motivated to achieve things, and most of us understand how that feels. When writing this script, there were countless examples of likable, motivated characters, but I couldn't think of a single likable character who has no goal, and I think that says a lot.
We've also talked about suffering before in one of our previous character development videos, but this is a really important trait and trick to make a character more likable to your audience. Think about every character that you've watched on TV or read in a book. When they've suffered, generally we sympathize and empathize with them, and this makes us like them more. We want them to succeed because we want to believe that when we fall down and get hurt, we can get back up and be a better person.
You'll see this used in a lot of stories, where stories started with some traumatic incident that pushes our character onto their journey. It makes us like them. It makes us want them to succeed because of how awful that experience was for them.
You do need to be careful about using suffering in your story too much, because it could feel a little bit manipulative on behalf of the reader. We don't want to guilt our reader into liking a character, but a little bit of hardship and showing them overcoming an obstacle definitely makes characters more likable. Just remember, there are no perfect characters, and a character who doesn't have a struggle generally isn't a character that we like very much. So just be careful and use this in reasonable amounts that are realistic to the setting of your story. When we talk about natural character development, we're talking about the gradual change in a character's personality and behavior over the course of a story. When we're doing this, we need to make sure that it has two key elements. It needs to be believable and it needs to be authentic. By believable and authentic, we mean that it has to reflect the changes that we see in actual people in the world around us. Of course, this can depend on the rules within the world of your own story, but in general, we want to try and make sure that it is believable and authentic so our reader can buy into this journey, so that they can invest in the character's journey and they will believe that it's actually happening and therefore believe that the story is happening. It's not just about this one character, it's about the story as a whole. So getting this right is really, really important. This natural change is so important because, as I just said, we want to help the reader invest into the character's journey. We want to connect with somebody that we can empathize with, that we could put ourselves in their shoes and make similar choices and make similar growth. If the change is unrealistic or unnatural, unnaturally fast or unnaturally slow, then as a reader it can be difficult to invest in that journey and want to follow along and find out what happens next because we simply don't believe what we're reading. Again, of course there has to be a little bit of balance here, but in general we want to try and make this growth as realistic as possible, and there are a few ways that we can do this within our story. So for this video, let's have a look at some of the things that you need to be doing as a writer to make your character's development believable and natural. But also let's look at a few things that we need to avoid that would otherwise undermine that development. In the past, we've spoken a lot about different elements of character development, and so some of those things are important for making things natural, but I'm not going to be going over them in a lot of detail in this video because we've spoken about them before. If you haven't watched those videos, please go back and watch them because there's more detail in those.
First of all, we need consistency within our characters. Our actors should display consistent behavior, thoughts and actions that align with their personality, motivations and background. If a character's development seems sudden or out of character, it can be jarring and take readers out of the story. This means, as a writer, you need to plan out who your character is and have a firm understanding of where they're from, what they want, and what actions or thoughts are typical for them. The reason this makes for natural character development is because it avoids contrivances by allowing you to fully understand a character's capabilities within a given situation. It forces you as a writer to think about creative ways to leverage their skills to help them overcome obstacles, or where points of failure can occur within the story. Professor Snape is a deeply compelling character in Harry Potter, mostly because he's so consistent in his behaviour, even when his character's compelling and sympathetic backstory is revealed. If our character is consistently written, then the second thing we need to do to have convincing character development is to have the changes occur gradually over time. I'll be brief here, as we discuss time in our effort video, but any changes should happen slowly, just as they do in real life. You are not the same person you were 10 years ago, but it's very difficult for you to feel that change happen to you day by day. To achieve this, you need to make sure you track any subtle changes that occur to your character, and how that will gradually mould their growth or decline. There is an exception here, which are sudden events occurring to a character that may force a change within them. Shock defeats or surprises that make them adopt a new view or posture. This can be very effective, but you have to be careful that they're not contrived. Make sure you have a compelling reason for this event to occur, and an equally compelling change that happens as a consequence. Research can be very useful here to see how different traumas or shocks have affected real-life people. You can draw on their experiences to make the growth of your characters convincing. In The Kite Runner, Amir undergoes a gradual transformation, changing from a timid and cowardly boy to a courageous adult influenced by the guilt of betraying his friend Hassan and being an immigrant in America. Hassan, on the other hand, has a rapid change as the result of the trauma he suffers. Both are compelling and realistically done, and this divide between them is one of the most interesting parts of the novel. Once your character is established and the change has started to occur over time, we need to establish the motivator of that change. This can come from two sources, internal and external. Internal change is usually as a result of characters reconciling with their own flaws and making steps to improve them. This plays well against external forces that may be compelling your character to change, which they can either embrace or reject. Either action tells us about who they are as a character and gives us a point of reflection to look back on later. Combining these two allows us to create nuanced and compelling characters like Jane Eyre, who struggles with her internal desires and society's external expectations. As a writer, the best way to achieve this is twofold. Allowing characters to make mistakes and fail, as we've talked about before, gives them an opportunity to understand their own limitations, which can feed into internal conflict and provide a catalyst for change. The mistake shows that they are human and allows our readers to connect, as well as providing a rational reason for the change. The second great tool is dialogue. Conversations between your characters allow you an opportunity to voice internal conflict, as well as provide external pressure from other actors who may feel differently. Dialogue is so crucial for allowing us to show rather than tell when it comes to characters' thoughts and motivations. More than that, most of our changes in real life tend to come as a result of conversation with people who have differing or beneficial perspectives. This is something the reader can connect with, as they will doubtless have had many life-changing conversations at some point in their life. Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird is a wonderful example of how a character grows as they try to navigate their own very well-voiced beliefs against the backdrop of external factors that are resolutely against that. We get to see the limits of this character and the steps he takes to grow and overcome them. Finally, there are some additional things that you can do to add some realism to your character's progression, but aren't necessarily crucial for a successful novel. First of all, you should make sure to build realistic relationships between your characters. Almost all people have relationships of one form or another with people, and they can be crucial for forming who we are as people. You should try to afford the same gifts to your characters in order to make their growth multifaceted. They provide great opportunities for dialogue and allow us to show more than telling, as the dynamic between people can tell us a lot about who a person is. Secondly, and perhaps most difficultly, using symbolism and imagery is a great way to make your character growth compelling. It may not make it natural per se, but it can connect the story with something real within your readers. Symbolism and imagery can be used to highlight your character's journey and the struggle they've been through. By using symbolic objects, actions, or events, writers can create a deeper layer of meaning that resonates with readers and helps them connect with the story on a more visceral level. The Old Man and the Sea is a great example of a relatively simple story, actually representing the power of perseverance and resilience whilst battling against larger forces such as nature and the knowledge of our own mortality. These are things that as a reader we can connect with.
So, that's all we have time for today, and I hope that the next time you're reading your favourite book or watching a movie, you can see how the best characters are the ones who develop naturally over time with consistent growth that it aligns with the story and who they are as a person.
Nothing in life is free. This is something that all adults understand, as our lives are moulded and dictated by the need to make sacrifices in order to achieve what we want, to pursue our goals, and to become better, more successful people. There are few things more fundamental to understand when creating characters than necessitating the need for them to make sacrifices to achieve their ends. We've talked about suffering before, but I want to make sacrifice distinct from this, because it is clear to me that it is different, and the way we apply it yields different effects. The first important difference is that sacrifice is often voluntary. To advance our story, our hero must choose to let something they treasure go. You can think about your own life to illustrate this. Have you ever wanted to quit a bad habit? To do this, you must sacrifice the good feelings that that habit gives you, whether it's a sugar high from junk food, the endorphin rush from social media, or the numbness of alcohol. To be stronger, you must sacrifice that feeling. It can cause suffering, but suffering can just happen to our character, and we need to watch them overcome it. There is something different about seeing our character choose to give something up that is part of their life or personality in order to complete their task. Sacrifice is also distinct from suffering, in that it doesn't have to be negative. Think about any sacrifice you've seen in media, and it is almost always portrayed as a positive thing. But it is something that is defining the way we see that character too. Protagonist and antagonist both sacrifice things in the name of achieving their goal. They may not suffer immediately, but they change and grow as characters as they conduct the sacrifice, and we as the reader learn more about them and what they are willing to invest to reach the end. It's integral to raising the stakes. Think about the topics we've discussed before, such as sport or politics. 85% of footballers never go into higher education in the UK, and 32% of UK MPs get divorced while they are in office. What makes their stories so compelling and interesting is partly because of the sacrifices these people have made to serve something higher than themselves. So now that we have an idea of how sacrifice stands apart from suffering, let's define exactly what we mean when we use sacrifice in a narrative sense. Typically, a sacrifice will take the form of the character losing an important object or person to achieve an end, such as Stannis sacrificing his daughter or Amy Cadaret giving up her necklace to save the farm. We are often drawn to more dramatic examples, such as characters sacrificing their own lives to ensure a mission succeeds, and there are countless examples of this, but the principles are the same: voluntarily losing something valuable so the mission can succeed. To make a good sacrifice, you need to establish that the thing being sacrificed is actually significant to the person giving it up. It's why the ancient Romans would sacrifice their best cattle rather than a rabbit to appease their gods, because it was valuable, and that's what made the gesture potent and significant. Throughout your story, you need to show the thing's importance, and this can usually be done through dialogue if it's a character, or through character interactions with the said object. Do they look at it often? Do they run it through their hands at regular intervals, hold it close when another comes near? We can establish the importance of things rather easily by paying attention and planning ahead of time. Frodo clutches the ring. Thanos dotes on his daughter. Essentially, you need to show an investment of energy from the sacrificer into the figurative lamb. The timing of an actual sacrifice is more difficult within a story. First of all, make sure your story isn't contrived and designed too heavily around that sacrifice. Don't make it unnecessary, or people will feel manipulated. We've talked about fake-out deaths before, and they are a classic example of lazy sacrifices in many cases where death was completely unnecessary. I'm looking at you, Man of Steel, No Time to Die, and Titanic. The sacrifice has to be the only way through an obstacle, and that requires planning on your part. Don't have the bomb conveniently not work in Armageddon just so you can have the heroic death. In Rogue One, everybody dies, but this is a good example of the sacrifice being necessary and unavoidable. Or Boromir in The Lord of the Rings. His death, which still results in a failure, was heroic nonetheless because it was unavoidable. Time your sacrifices to be at pivotal moments within your story that show the growth of the character making the sacrifice. But again, they do not need to be deaths. Indiana Jones leaving the Holy Grail is a good example, Harry Potter giving up the Elder Wand, or Jon Snow sacrificing his love for Ygritte to rejoin the Night's Watch. That's the key element here. A sacrifice should represent the character growing beyond their attachment to objects or people in order to serve a higher purpose. It's why they are useful. They illustrate the character's connection to something and then show how they've evolved beyond dependence on it, or how they can understand that losing it serves a higher purpose and it's necessary for them to do that. That is what we're trying to isolate with this idea. A distinct character moment that shows the dedication to the goal they've set for themselves, reveals something deeper about them as a character, and at an even deeper level, it shows that the character is not perfect, as they cannot achieve success with all the conditions in their favour. They must lose something to get more, because they are not perfect and able to do it now. They are making an investment of giving up some form of happiness and security for long-term gain. A character who never sacrifices anything isn't interesting. The stakes are lower, the depth of the character is shallower, and we miss a huge chance to learn about the values that the character holds dear. So, the next time you're watching a film, reading a book, or writing your own story, ask yourself whether the character has lost anything to achieve their success. Is it a real loss or just a contrivance that looks like one? Do we see them regretting that decision when things don't go to plan, or hesitating to make the choice in the first place? Do they look like you and all the opportunities that you didn't take, and all the things that you've deprived yourself to get to where you are now?
Something that seems to be a modern trend that I and many others have noticed is the prospect of a self-insert character.
For those unfamiliar with the concept, a self-insert is a character who, rather than being unique or properly contextualized participant in the story, instead serves as a surrogate for the writer. They embody a disproportionate amount of the characteristics and traits of their creator, identify with the same politics, ideology, or ideas, and behave exactly as they would behave, only in a more positive, moralistic, and pronounced way. On top of all of that, the creator tends to remove any negative traits they may have to serve their own ego, and the result is a character who would be insufferable in the real world, but that is universally liked in-world, and has the narrative constructed around them to such an extent that the writing will bend over backwards with contrivances to allow this character to exist and face little to no consequences for their actions. As you might be able to tell, I'm not a massive fan of this new trend, but I want to more fundamentally examine why this is a problem, and why you need to avoid doing this in your own story. More than that, I do want to look at ways that you can integrate parts of your own personality and experiences into your creation, without it being cheap, or looking like your ego has inflated to astronomical proportions. Well, I've already mentioned in brief why these characters are an issue, but to be honest, they are all rather superfluous reasons, and the biggest reasons are actually deeper and simpler. The real reasons these characters are a problem is twofold. It isn't balanced, and it's lazy. A good character in any book is a combination of positive and negative attributes, strengths and weaknesses, established skills, and areas left wanting. In order to successfully insert a character that is balanced and realistic, based on yourself, requires an enormous amount of introspection, self-reflection, and brutal honesty that is usually only reserved for Buddhist monks. If you believe that you are capable of being completely honest about who you are, can state your strengths truthfully without overinflation rather than making them what you want them to be, that you can represent your weaknesses fairly without excusing them away, and can account for each and every facet of your life, well, then you may be able to pull off the trick. The point is that not many people can honestly represent themselves on paper without slipping into fantasizing and exacerbation. The balance required in a character, where they suffer, sacrifice, are hated and disliked, attacked and flawed in many aspects, is much harder to achieve when you're dealing with yourself. Most people aren't ready to be that honest with themselves, and the sacrifices they must make to realize their dream self. This is why psychologists and therapists exist in great numbers, and why self-help books are eternally popular. Because most of us need help to be honest with ourselves. There is a certain arrogance with portraying oneself on paper as a separate character, but one who inhabits all the wonderful things that make you you, while ignoring all the problematic parts. There is a strong likelihood that you will compensate for all your real-world deficiencies by making your in-fiction self all-powerful. This is why we like video games. They allow us to be perfect and unstoppable, but they rarely lead us to make balanced characters if we're given total control over the character's personality and abilities. It's why Skyrim turns into a power fantasy by the end, and Ghost of Tsushima doesn't. As for the lazy side of things, well, it simply is lazy to chuck down the superhero version of yourself on paper, rather than go through the work of creating a character that is contextually relevant, complex, flawed, integrated into the world, and able to be critically evaluated by the author and others. By having real characters, you as the author are forced to put in more work to develop them, to write their traits in more detail. You are less likely to forget key characteristics that you assume of yourself, and you will be better able to more objectively evaluate them within the narrative without the bias attached to your own character. This will give you a much greater sense of achievement, as it allows you to more honestly develop them, as well as avoiding the trap of dictating to your audience how they should feel about your character. A theme I've noticed in lots of modern Hollywood writers is that the creators become very defensive when characters are criticized as shallow or underdeveloped. This strikes me as the writers feeling personally attacked, rather than having a rational reaction to critique. This is almost certainly a consequence of them inserting too much of themselves, their beliefs, or their ideals into the character, and then they aren't able to respond objectively. Having insert characters makes it much harder for you to evaluate your work, receive honest feedback, and improve your skill as a writer.
If you are serious about improving and understand that you're still developing as an author, then you need to give yourself the space to grow, to learn from others, and to detach yourself somewhat from the elements you've created. Putting yourself on paper, or a personified version of your deepest held beliefs into the story, makes this much harder, and makes you far more likely to become complacent about improving your skills. So, how can we do this? Haruki Murakami is a great example of an author inserting themselves into their own narrative. What Murakami does so exceptionally well is to include negative or not entirely positive traits of himself into his characters. He does not insert his entire personality, but instead imbues many of his characters with a sense of introvertedness and introspection that he also feels. He makes a core part of his character's journey about finding meaning in their lives. This is something that Murakami has spoken about before, and it is a good example of how you can insert part of yourself into the story. It is much more immersive to introduce negative parts of your own character into a creation, as J.K. Rowling does with Harry Potter and his sense of abandonment and loneliness that she experienced. Or how Hemingway's Jake Barnes shares the author's experience of war and injury, and how Sylvia Plath's Esther Greenwood demonstrates much of the battle that Plath herself had with mental illness, depression, and suicide. You should avoid making any insert character amazing and fantastic and instantly likable. Instead, use your experience of something negative to mold a new character and have us follow their journey against adversity or their recovery from said trauma. I should be clear. You are not inserting your ideology or particular viewpoint or any perceived adversity you may or may not have had, but negative characteristics and traits that you do have, that you must have because nobody is perfect. This requires honesty, and if you're not up to that, then don't insert yourself into the story. However, the level of honesty needed to put in some negative elements is less than putting an entire, true representation of yourself into the narrative. Just taking a piece, with a focus on the negatives, forces you to be more honest, but can also allow you to make a character that you can understand and empathize with. Another way to insert characters is to have them as secondary or tertiary members of the cast who will have minor impacts on the story. This can be a way for you to vent your desire to be included without taking focus away from the main characters. Again, this requires a degree of honesty. George R.R. Martin has said that Samwell Tarly very closely resembles himself with his size, fears, and bookish nature. Martin understands who he is, and introduces an honest enough reflection of himself as a side character. Notice that this is not a negative, downbeaten character, but one who is realistically flawed and contextually accurate within the world. Authors such as Martin avoid making their self-insert the focal point of the story, at the expense of other characters. This in turn creates a more balanced and immersive narrative with characters who are allowed to grow naturally apart from the author's vision. In my own story, the character of George is very much an insert for myself, but I've made sure to relegate him to sidekick, to not overinflate his importance, and to definitely not let any of my worldview into that story. George serves to support the main protagonist as her confidant and companion, not to overshadow her with my ego. This has been a challenge, but also a positive, humbling, and self-reflective exercise. The main character, however, is a self-insert of my grandma, but this is more acceptable, as I can be more objective with how I portray her, and have taken steps to make sure my own philosophy does not overtake her own as I write. This is why I have conducted hours upon hours of interviews with her, to learn as much as I can, so that I can represent her fairly and honestly. This is the other point of insert characters. They don't have to be yourself. They can be other people that you know, or whose work you are more intimately aware of. There is obviously a risk here, because you need to make sure you portray or insert them appropriately and fairly, or be prepared to face the backlash. Like when you imagine yourself, it's important to make sure that you're not fantasizing or extrapolating pre-existing beliefs that you have about them. If you're going to include other people, make sure it's based on interviews where you can deep dive into their beliefs, experience, and views, or make sure you engross yourself in the books or content seriously, rather than basing it off soundbites on TikTok. You need to detach your presuppositions, positive and negative, from your portrayal of this figure, not only because you hopefully want to produce something honest, but also for the integrity of your own story and your reputation. Take care not to manipulate their views or beliefs, especially if they are not aligned with your own. It can be very tempting to idolize or demonize people based on their views and use that temptation to write a story that allows you to vent at them from the safety of your keyboard. But this very rarely produces something that will stand the test of time. It's an emotional rather than a creative outburst, and should be reserved for therapy rather than literature. The final point, and one that reflects all of the characteristics we've discussed in this series, is that your self-insert, or any character for that matter, needs to be developed properly. They need to sacrifice, suffer, be weak, face challenges, and be clearly motivated. If you're going to insert them, make a significant effort to develop them as you would any other fully formed character in a book. This avoids the common problem of self-inserts being flat and one-dimensional characters who fail to engage the reader, or simply take to preaching the writer's particular worldview. Taking into consideration all the necessary ingredients for strong characters allows you to build fully formed, detailed, and rich actors who make your story far more interesting. Do the work to critically evaluate the characters. Go through the necessary steps for them to grow and change. The only thing here that you will notice is that soon enough they'll stop resembling you, if you've done it properly. And that leads to the most important point. If you don't self-insert, or insert anybody else for that matter, you don't have to deal with any of these problems. It is much easier to simply not put yourself or anyone else in the story at all, and realize that doing so very rarely will improve the story. If you're using your experiences, extract those, honestly and in isolation, and put them into a new character who is not you. Typically, we are not writing stories for personal wish fulfillment, or self-aggrandizement, or to make idealized versions of ourselves. The theme throughout this video has been honesty. Look at your intentions, your flaws and capabilities, and be honest. Truly, really be honest about whether you need to have a version of yourself here, and whether you can accurately portray others too. You may think highly of yourself, but there will be people who don't. We don't all agree on every issue, and expecting that is the height of arrogance. Be humble, be honest, be hardworking to make a character who is interesting for any reader, not just for you and whoever agrees with you. And remember that regardless of viewpoint, ideology, creed, religion, political affiliation, ethnicity, culture, sex, gender, or any other category you wish to put yourself into, we are hopefully writing to produce beautiful stories that inspire and entertain by providing the world with angelic music rather than the sound of us blowing our own trumpets.
Character agency is a fundamental part of creating any good character. Today, I want to give you 3 tips on how you can make sure your characters are strong, independent actors that feel alive and real, rather than like marionette puppets on the writer's string. Before we do just that, we should define what character agency is exactly. Simply, character agency refers to the ability and motivation of a character in a story to make choices and to take actions that drive the plot forward. It's a fundamental aspect of storytelling and plays a crucial role in creating engaging and dynamic narratives. When we talk about agency, we talk about the ability of characters to make decisions that fit with their personality and background without them feeling like it's being dictated by the writers themselves. You want your characters to feel alive and free. You yourself have agency in the real world. The more freedom you have over aspects of your life, the more agency you have. The more power you have to affect things around you, the more agency there is in your life. The same should be the case for your characters too, if you want them to be engaging and interesting for your reader. Now, a character being in prison, like Andy Dufresne, doesn't mean that they don't have agency just because they are not in a position of authority or to make all of the free decisions available to them. Agency is far more personal than that. It's much more about what they can do that creates an intriguing narrative, but that also comes from within them. Andy is able to take many actions that push the story onwards and are in line with his character, despite being physically restricted.
Wonder Woman is the same, as despite not being the most knowledgeable person of the era she finds herself in, she makes strong and free decisions that she fully owns, rather than it feeling like the writer playing out a power fantasy using Wonder Woman as an action doll. Similarly, a character being forced to act in certain ways by the world around them or other characters, like Bilbo being sent on an unexpected adventure, do not deny them agency either. Agency is more about how the characters react to new situations and the things that are out of their control, rather than being the instigator of everything all the time in every situation. Bilbo embraces the unknown and does his best to deal with it in the small ways that he can. Sarah Connor is another great example of a character being pressured and forced to take certain decisions, but ultimately making her own choices that reflect her agency and will to achieve the goal of escaping the various Terminators that are sent after her. So let's look at 3 crucial elements to creating strong agency when you're writing. First of all, your characters have to be proactive rather than reactive most of the time. Your characters should be taking action that actively molds the events and the narrative. When a character is simply someone who things happen to, the story comes across very much as a concept or situation that the writer thought was cool and wanted to include, but didn't actually account for any of the choices and characters within it. The film Battleship is an example where things just sort of happen, and the characters watch the spectacle rather than doing anything meaningful or feeling like independent actors. Your character needs to be making decisions that impact the plot, like Ripley hunting down the alien or Max deciding to turn back to help Furiosa. These are choices that come across as if the characters themselves have made the decision, rather than being dictated to by the silent writer. The decisions must be hard, and they must be crafted into your story to have an impact. They also don't have to be successful all the time either, and unexpected consequences are a great way to generate more opportunities for agency, but they have to matter, and they can't just be knee-jerk reactions all the time. Just like in the real world, the decisions that you make about your lifestyle indicate how much agency you have. If you make the positive changes now, rather than waiting for a doctor to tell you to do so, you have more agency. Second, your characters need to have defined goals and motivations. The importance of these has been covered in another video, but you need a reason behind the actions that your characters are making. Forrest Gump isn't doing all he's doing and retelling his story for no reason. He's doing so because he wants to be with his childhood sweetheart. This gives his choices more depth and emotional complexity, and therefore the character more agency, as we feel he is making clear and logical decisions rather than contrived ones foisted upon him by the writer. Contrast this with something like the Twilight films, where Bella seems to be pushed along by the other characters in the story and very rarely makes her own defined decisions with goals and motivations clearly laid out. This doesn't mean that she's a terrible character per se, just that she doesn't have very much agency, or the goals or defined motivations outside of the surface-level desires that she states. It makes her unbelievable as a character, and hard for the reader to emotionally invest in. This then very much comes across as the writer enjoying their concept, a vampire-woman-werewolf love triangle, far more than letting the characters enjoy it themselves. The final part is another that we've discussed before, which is that we need to create character growth and evolution as the character moves through the decisions before them. Their agency should swell as they gain more experience and their decisions impact the world around them, and they learn how to make better choices in the future. If you don't want them to feel shuttled through the story like Sam Witwicky in Transformers, just being moved from set piece to set piece and growing very little as a character, then you need to make sure that there is genuine moments of reflection and expansion for your characters, to let them grow and breathe and gain more agency. Batman changes his worldview across the Dark Knight and certainly grows beyond his strict moral code into something equating a more realistic and rounded character. So just remember, your characters should be treated as people, not pawns or prisoners that you move around. The more freedom you give them, the more interesting your story will be to your reader, the less predictable the narrative will appear, and the more alive your characters will seem to your audience. Character agency is the key. Let them exist beyond the confines of your ideas, ideology, or concepts so that they can truly start to live.
When your character has reached the end of their journey, their development cycle is complete and you're preparing to wrap up the story. For now, at least. We've got to end things right. Like a gymnast polishing off an amazing routine, it's crucial to stick the landing. If we stumble and fall, it doesn't matter how good the build-up was if you don't pull off the end. There are some obvious things that we need to do. We need to resolve any of the big, hanging questions that we've asked from the character over the story. Will Harry beat Voldemort? Will Katniss save Panam? Will Philomena find her son? Will Father Rodriguez keep his faith? Whatever questions you've posed or whatever lesson you want them to learn, it's very important to answer that question so our reader is satisfied. If you don't know what the question is, think about the motivation that you've established for your character and have some sort of resolution for that. We have to be careful that if you've asked lots of questions or there are many threads to be tied up, that you space these out appropriately. Those final scenes or conversations shouldn't be a checklist of motivations, but should play out more naturally. Mostly just focus on the main conflicts that need resolving, and you can leave some of the smaller mysteries to the imagination of the reader, as long as you don't think it will leave them dissatisfied or you've put more weight on it throughout the story. You want to avoid excessive detail. While closure is essential, be mindful of not over-explaining or inundating your reader with information. Instead, maintain a consistent tone and leave some room for interpretation. A great way to achieve that latter point is to use some symbolism in the actions of your characters. Frodo returning home doesn't need to be over-described. The fact that he came home is great closure for his character and good enough by itself. Just spend time revisiting key objects, characters, and locations that are thematically or narratively important to your character. Have Frodo hand over his diary to Sam at a symbolically important location. The green light on the bay fades at the end of The Great Gatsby, and Elizabeth Bennet and Mr. Darcy are able to finally engage in open and honest communication on their past misunderstandings at the closure of Pride and Prejudice. These provide a very clear and satisfying end to our character's journey, where they can see the growth of each person that they've spent all that time with, and how character moments or symbolic objects are great ways to show that. You should try and draw attention to small details that hint at something larger, and tell us about the journey. Father Rodriguez holds his crucifix at the end of his life. Amir redeems himself by passing the red scarf to Hassan's son. Andy Dufresne leaves his rock hammer behind after he escapes. Dorian Gray shatters his pocket watch to show the irreversible consequences of his choices. Even though we're talking about character closure, objects are a great way to show this without having page-long monologues explaining the change in excruciating detail. The most important aspect of all of this is the fact that you need to have a different, but recognizable character at the end of your story. If you're following the hero's journey, then eventually they will return to the land that they left, but be different and feel out of place. If they slot back into their previous lives without issue or qualm, then you haven't done it right. Your character has to wrestle with the changes they've undergone when they return to their old life. How you resolve that doesn't really matter, but the fact that it's present is a great way to leave things. Just remember to keep the tone consistent. If you've written a serious and dark book, don't suddenly have it be a happy clappy ending. And don't have a super dark ending to a light and cheery narrative. You can give hints of the opposite in order to trigger the imagination of your reader, but consistency is key. If you can get that mixture right, then you can really satisfy your reader and make sure you give the character that you've spent so much time on and so much time with, that they get the send-off they deserve.